Welcome to Nav Chat, the show for the New Zealand orienteering and navigation sports community. Joe, how's it going?
Good, Gene. It's good, thanks.
So a quick announcement for everyone. We've got a few changes to Nav Chat coming up. Instead of just Tom Reynolds and myself, we're going to be rolling through with some other co-hosts. So this should help add some different perspectives to what we talk about, and hopefully, enable a slightly more varied show. And we're also changing a few things around the structure of the show, and that'll be obvious, or if it's not obvious, then that's fine. So I won't explain any of that. But Joe, how have you been the past month? Last time I saw you was after World Champs in Denmark, and you flew home. The rest of us have been having a good time here in Europe, and you went back to winter. So how have you been?
Yeah, I feel very jealous seeing all the photos and feel off on adventures in Europe. I'm coming back to, I think it's the wettest winter Christchurch has had for a long time. So it's been a bit of a shock to the system. But yeah, it's been good. Starting to get back into a bit of training now. It's been fun.
What are you working towards, and what's the schedule?
There's a bit of a lack of orienteering events on the horizon, but the ultra long is definitely something I want to compete at. That's at the start of September.
Cool. And is that at Hog's Back once again?
Yeah, it's a cool course. It's a one way from Hog's Back to the Castle Hill Village.
Okay. Have they extended the map further then?
We'll have to wait and see, but there is sort of a gap between the two maps. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do, but that's the plan so far.
I've run the trail back just in a run, which is really nice. And yeah, I can see how it's not too far to connect that final flat area and then down through the beach forest into Castle Hill Village. So yeah, that'll be really cool. I am feeling a bit jealous about missing out on that one. But are you keeping yourself entertained? Like, how's the coverage of the European races for you?
Yeah, it's been good. I love watching JWOC and a bit of looking at a bit of the O-ring and results now. That's been cool. Yeah, JWOC was obviously quite different, but it made for some really exciting races in the sprints in the town.
I thought so too. I thought it was really interesting, and the commentators were great, and they had the GPSs. Yeah, were a bit flaky, but they had a lot of GPSs on people, so they could really bring up whoever they wanted onto the tracking when they were doing well. And yeah, I thought it was really cool to watch. And yeah, so we'll get into some of those topics later on, but a few other things that I thought was interesting and notable in the past month was World Games, which also had coverage. That was kind of interesting from a different perspective. Did you watch the sprint?
I haven't watched the full thing yet, but I sort of skimmed through a bit. Yeah, it caught me by surprise, that one.
Yeah, so the course looked quite cool. What I found interesting and surprising was they didn't have the usual IOF commentators in there. They actually had some commentators who were not orienteers. And I thought they did reasonably well, considering how complex and specific orienteering is. And I think there were some interesting points to learn here, actually. The commentators were pretty much doing a good job until they looked at the GPS tracking. And we, after using GPS trackers for years, know how wobbly they are and know how they drift off to the side and then kind of stay with that offset for quite some time. They sit 20, 30 meters off to the east, and you have to translate that GPS track in your mind. But it was really throwing the commentators off. They really believed that the GPS tracker was absolutely accurate. And so that's one thing probably to learn when we do more tracking stuff in the future, that actually this is now the barrier to newcomers understanding orienteering. It's not actually what's going on, because we've got so many cameras out in the forest, out in the terrain. We've got people with cameras following runners, but it's actually the GPS is misleading especially around high buildings where the GPS tracks get bounced around. So yeah, that was one other thing that I found quite interesting about World Games, but it's great that Tim got a gold. So he won the sprint there. And just a bit of background on World Games, it's only some countries get the chance to send their teams there. So it's a bit of a half-baked field. And I think a lot of people take it as quite a fun series of races, especially when you've just come down from the highs of World Champs. So that's a bit of a context on why it maybe doesn't get quite so much coverage given kind of World Games' status in the world.
Yeah, still mostly the top of the top nations turn up, and then you have some others filling in the gaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Tim definitely had to push out like Casper Fossa and a number of other top runners to win. So yeah, that was pretty cool. Pretty cool to watch. And it looked really hot as well.
And humid. I saw lots of athletes commenting about that. That was quite different to their sort of European summer temperatures and humidity.
Mm-hmm. Cool. We also had some mountain bike orienteering that's been going on in Europe. So this was a few pictures from the field. Martin Peet, our lone representative at World Mountain Bike Orienteering Champs. So that's really cool that we could have a silver fern there. And just remind everyone that New Zealand does have these sports. Quick snippet of the map. Have you done much mountain bike orienteering, Joe?
I've never done it. I've planned Rogaines for it that Martin Peet's competed at. But no, I've never done it myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've done a little bit, and it's I guess it was like sprint orienteering, but with a lot more map memory because you're focusing on the ground a lot more. So yeah, it's interesting. Definitely some challenges that you could hum and ha over. Some route choice challenges that you could think about for quite a long time. So yeah, it's a tough one, and I'm not surprised that people like Tim Robertson do quite well at this, with that really fast information processing with these multiple routes. And here's a photo of Tim also on the podium. Pretty happy with that chunky medal, super chunky, really cool. European 5 days. That's we'll get more into that later. But you wanted to talk about World Masters Games a little bit.
Yeah. So there was one race I saw that Daniel Himman actually got beaten. Which coming into World Masters, I thought, oh, he's racing. That's a bit sad for everyone else there. But he actually had a bit of a nightmare at this number 5 on the middle distance, and he was fresh. He hadn't raced the sprint beforehand.
So Daniel Hubman's in blue, and his competitor Oscar Alexander is in red. And it looks like he just narrowly missed it twice.
He mentioned on his Instagram that he was like just beside it and just didn't see the flag. So it was one of those where he was in the right place. Yeah.
Yeah, that looks pretty brutal. It seems like a undue punishment for being so close. But it does happen from time to time that you just haven't gone quite far enough to see the flag, or there's a tree in your way or something like that. So hey, it happens to all of us. But yeah, that must have been pretty hard to stomach when he came home and looked at his GPS and saw how close he had gone to the control twice.
Yeah, for sure. He was pretty gracious in defeat. From the photos I saw, I thought it was pretty cool for that Ukrainian Alexander to be able to beat Daniel Himman. And his best result before this was 28th place in EOC Long back in 2010, which Daniel beat him. Mm-hmm. Daniel actually won that race by 18 minutes. So yeah, he's had history with Daniel in the past, but Daniel's been so far ahead. So that was cool to get a chance to beat him, I imagine.
And this is the sprint terrain that they used, which looks fun as well. Lots of route choice challenges to solve for. GPS is not making much sense in the high buildings as well. You can see them just bouncing around all over the place, but the terrain looked fun. And yeah, I hope everyone's there had quite a good time on the coast there in the middle of the holiday season.
Yeah, quite a few contours in that sprint as well, as you can see.
Yeah, definitely another element to consider, something we don't often have to deal with in sprint orienteering. But you really have to understand the contours on this map also. Cool. Any other things from the past month that you've done or found interesting?
2 weeks ago, I went down to Snow Farm with the WMOC funded trip. So that was pretty cool. It was not often we get to do ski orienteering in New Zealand. So this is a yearly event that's put on by the Remarkables Orienteering Club, sort of spearheaded by Chris and Emily Fawn. So that's pretty cool. It was 2 days. First day was a long distance, and the second day is a 1 hour or 2 hour row game. So that was quite good fun. It was a slightly smaller field this year because a lot of people had taken an opportunity to go to Europe or to the schools events that are happening the same weekend. But it was still a nice turnout and a really good day on the first day for the long distance. Blue skies, no wind.
So people have cross-country skis? I really haven't seen anyone other than Chris with cross-country skis in New Zealand.
Most people there, so hire them. And if you go to the event, and you pay the entry fee for the orienteering, they give you half price for, maybe it's the trail pass, but it's also quite cheap to hire the cross-country skis as well. And that's quite cool. There's actually 2 different types of cross-country skis, so you can get a chance to test out both of them. One's sort of better for beginners, but you can't go quite as fast, and the other one is a bit more advanced, but you can get a lot better speed.
Interesting. Yeah, I still haven't done it, but would definitely be interested in giving it a crack one time. And I imagine it's fairly similar to mountain bike orienteering in the sense that the route choices are quite discrete, very much like sprint orienteering. But
yes,
is the scheduling the main challenge, or can you ski without looking at the ground?
You can ski without looking at the ground. Not many people have map boards. So you can get map boards that kind of attach to a harness in front of you, so you can read the map as you're going. Whereas most people are either holding the map on the hand, or you have a piece of string around your neck holding, and then that tied onto the map. You can also go off track in the ski orienteering, so that doesn't normally happen in the mountain bike orienteering. So that's another sort of element to it.
Cool. All right, some interesting stuff that's happened over the past month. Should we get on to the guest interview? I had a chance to sit down and talk with Nick Hann, who's been a long-time competitor of mine and also quite a good mapper in my personal opinion. And so I sat down with him and asked him a few questions about his mapping.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, Nick. Thanks for coming on Nav Chat.
That's okay. Nice to be here.
So Tom and I were keen to hear from some of the mappers who have done a lot of the maps we really love to run on over the past years. And I thought I'd talk to you as someone who was quite interesting, as someone who got into mapping quite young, and pick your brains about what drew you to mapping and how you developed your style. So, but first, where are you in the country at the moment, and are you healthy and fit?
Yeah, pretty healthy. I'm in Queenstown currently. As you can see by this thick down jacket, it's fairly cold here, but that means there's lots of snow around, which is good. So fairly healthy and getting out amongst it. Haven't been doing much orienteering, but there's so much other stuff to do that it's been keeping me occupied. Yeah.
Cool. And when did you start orienteering? At what age?
I was towards the end of primary school, I think year 7. So that's quite a few years ago now. I'd have to calculate how many.
Yeah. And when did you first show an interest in mapping for orienteering?
Pretty soon afterwards. I guess I've always been fairly interested in maps, so orienteering was a good fit. But I didn't really do any orienteering mapping there for a couple of years. And I just started off with doing little updates and things for the Wellington Club, just like after school, just to sort of stop me from getting bored. Yeah.
And were they sprint maps, urban maps that you were updating for them, or did you get into the forest quite early?
I guess I got into the forest quite early in the sense that a lot of Wellington sprint maps are or were foresty, being in the town belt. I guess they were technically sprint maps, but there was a lot of off-track stuff in the bush. So I think maybe the first or second map I updated was Tinakori Hill, which is renowned for being particularly green and bushy. So yeah, I definitely didn't shy away from the forest maps in the beginning. But obviously, well, I think looking back, I think the sprint maps I did in the beginning were better than the forest maps. Forest maps are harder to get right, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about, because that transition to sprint where everything's quite discrete and the boundaries of things are quite clear, transitioning towards forest where you've got to come up with discrete boundaries in a place where the boundaries are more fuzzy and more continuous. So was that something you noticed as a challenge at the time?
Yeah, 100%. I guess starting off mapping, it was very easy to lose your sense of distance, and so you start mapping from one point and going into the forest, and you just lose the sense of scale, and then everything becomes warped. So I found I really had to define every area, segment it out using a track and a fence and a stream or whatever, just into little portions, and then you can sort of fill in the blanks between those obvious features. But like you say, with a sprint, everything's well defined. The main thing with a sprint is not putting everything in because it just doesn't fit. You've got to be very selective with your detail.
Cool. As you did more maps, when was the first map that you did on your own from scratch?
Would have been before I went over to Norway, so when I was still at high school. I'm not sure exactly which one. A lot of the maps I started with were, I guess, to like 1 to 10,000 sort of traditional orienteering maps, and then I converted them to sprint. So it was like a complete remap, basically a new map, just of somewhere that had already been mapped before. And that probably would have been pretty early on, maybe the 4th or 5th area I worked on. I'm not sure exactly. I have to go back to my records and confirm.
Yeah, that is moving pretty fast. I definitely found that I'd done a lot of sprint maps, but there was a point where I'd done a lot of sprint maps, but still didn't have the confidence to do contours in the forest. There was quite a long period of time where I was like in that middle ground. And it sounds like you progress quite fast. So do you have any tips on getting your head around mapping contours?
Having a really good base map to start with helps, obviously. If you've got LiDAR, that's great. Key thing with LiDAR is that it has so much detail in it, and often the detail doesn't actually exist in real life. And it's about simplifying that down. Whereas if you're starting with some other base map material like photogrammetry contours or something, often they don't have enough detail, and you've got to sort of figure out which parts of the photogrammetry are accurate and which parts aren't, and fill in the blanks there. And that can be pretty tricky, but often it's an iterative process. You'll do a bit and then you'll come at it from a different angle and you'll realize actually that's not quite right. I've got to fit 5 contours into the slope and it only looks like 2, so I've clearly messed something up somewhere else. But yeah, I guess my tip would be to get the solid base map as much as you can, even if it involves going out with a GPS and contouring around. Just by eye, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to give you some rough contour shapes to work with that you can then fill in the blanks between.
Cool. Do you feel like you developed your own style of mapping as you progress? Because at least as an orienteer competitor, I do notice that different mappers have different styles, and you can recognize some of those characteristics if you're familiar enough with a number of their maps. Do you feel like you developed a certain style, and in what way? How would one recognize a Nick Hann map?
I think I do to an extent. Obviously, you're somewhat limited by what's on the ground, but I think I liked somewhat being the key word there. There's always some interpretation available. I think not being too fixed on putting everything in its exact position, especially when you've got lots of features nearby. You've got the ability to spread things out quite a bit before anyone actually realizes that things are vastly distorted. And if it means they can read the map, I think that's definitely a better outcome.
So yeah, if it means that it's clearer on a printed page, maybe you can just spread things out a little bit.
Yeah, there's no point having features stacked on top of each other if it's more precise, because no one can read it. So you might as well not even put them on. Whereas if you just sort of spread them out, when we're mapping, especially on OCAD, we're very zoomed in, 32 times zoom or whatever. There's nobody reads a map like that when they're running through the forest. So I think, just like stepping back a bit, picking out what are the key features and then seeing what else can go in between. So yeah, I guess my style is simplified and somewhat artistic, as opposed to being true exactly to what's on the ground.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think at first when we grow up orienteering, we're super excited about how precise and accurate these maps are. And that might be the case most of the time, but yeah, it is impossible actually to do these maps and make them usable. I think, I really agree with you there. And do you think the same applies for a lot of sprint maps in some detailed 100%. Areas?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you look at like a wall, how thick is a wall? It might be like 200 millimeters thick, whereas what's it, 0.4 millimeters on the map? I don't know what that corresponds to, but it'd be at least a couple of meters printed on the map, which is crazy. So if you've got narrow passageways and buildings, and then we want to try and fit a man-made object in there with the big cross, that thing's massive. So you've really got to spread things out. Buildings, unless they're tiny buildings, they have a lot of ability to sort of shrink a bit and absorb some of that space to give you more room to make things clear.
Yeah, I think I've been surprised by how much you can shrink a building and as an orienteer, in the moment, not notice. You count the buildings and you see the shape of the buildings, but you don't see the length of the building and how much has been trimmed off sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that when there are big features like walls that are obvious on the ground, you need to keep them on the map and not introduce skinnier lines like, the fence without any tags, because it's just, no one can read it. You've got to remember, people are running. We're not walking around like we are when we're mapping. We're actually running during the race, so it's got to be easy to read in a hurry.
Cool. Well, there's some interesting ideas there, and hopefully some food for thought for those who are either mapping and thinking of improving or interested in getting into mapping. So thanks a lot, Nick, for sharing those ideas that you've developed over the years.
No worries, Jen. Thanks for having me.
That was really cool to hear from Nick. I recently took up a bit of mapping myself, so it was cool to hear how he sort of processes, especially for sprint maps, and how you really have to kind of simplify and change things around to improve the readability. I think he mapped Hogsback possibly, which is used for the ultralight we mentioned earlier. So there'll be a chance for everyone to experience a piece of mapping that he's done. And I think that was all without LiDAR. So there's a lot of forest in there that he was walking around to get all the contours, which really makes you appreciate a lot more when you think about it like that.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. I assumed most maps in the past 10 years had a LiDAR base, but yeah, that's interesting to know. I've also used some of his maps here in Wellington. That must have been some of his earlier ones. And you can see his style quite early on. There's very smooth lines, and maybe making the reentrance just a little bit wider than what they actually are on the map, so that they're more visible. And you can see, some of the boulders just spaced out a little bit more. So I think that's a good lesson. And obviously there's too far. There is a way to push that style too far. Personally, I've really enjoyed Nick's mapping. But as connoisseur of maps, I can definitely tell his style on paper. You can see the kind of smoothness. He also did Riverhead Forest, or the original Riverhead Forest map in Auckland, and that had those very rounded reentrance, and you kind of get there and things are a little more jagged, but you definitely don't miss the details on the map. So that was really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I've seen a little while ago, there was I think I saw on Facebook an example from I think it might have been an IOF sort of mapping conference even, and they spent a day all these mappers mapping the same piece of land, and it was really interesting to see all the different styles. It was the exact same location, but just every single mapper had a different way to sort of display the information.
Yeah, and I think this feeds into one of the topics that we've got coming up. So I'll let you start, though. You brought one really interesting topic to lead with. So what did you have to say about JWOC?
Yeah, so JWOC was quite special this year in the fact that quite late in the piece, the government placed a ban on all of the forest, so you couldn't enter the forest because of fire risks in Portugal. And I heard that the law to be able to do this is only enacted a year ago, so it was quite a recent thing, and this was a big thing to happen in Portugal. So that unfortunately mucked up a lot of the planned forest races, as there are 3-4 forest races in JWOC and only one sprint. So they had to work hard to organise something else. Luckily, as you can see there, the Kiwis had a chance to train in the forest beforehand, and I've chatted to some of them, and it sounds like they really enjoyed that. Quite drastic changes in the weather too. They had some of these trainings in thunderstorms and some of them in the 40-degree scorching heat. So it was quite varied over there. And one of the specialties is that, like I say, it was all quite late in the piece. The organisers had to scramble to add in some more races, so they decided to bring forward the first JWOC sprint relay, which was meant to occur next year, and they planned a sprint relay for 2 days after the sprint that went ahead as planned. But one quirk was, because this was so late in the piece, that they couldn't embargo any more maps, and all the teams had already been training on every single sprint map in the area that wasn't embargoed. So they had to reuse the same terrain and the same map for the sprint relay. And one quirk was that they were able to change where their temporary barriers were to change the map, but they also changed the mapping in some areas. So they removed, as you can see there near control 16, they actually took away an impassable wall, which opened up a route choice on the sprint relay. So if you go to the right there, Gene. So on those top two photos, the individual sprint is the left, where there is a wall between that building and the olive green, and now they've removed it on the next map, which they ran on 2 days later. And you can see in the terrain, it is passable. It's sort of an old rock formation, maybe. But I thought that was quite interesting, and I wonder what you thought about that, Gene, about changing how you map stuff just 2 days in between the same competition within a JWOC. Yeah,
I've never seen this happen before, but I'm not opposed to it. I definitely think that there is variability in the mapping all the time, and if this seems like a complete no-no to you, because the terrain, so just to someone who's listening is like, what the hell, you can't change the terrain, one of these maps must be wrong. Maybe you haven't realized that mapping is fuzzy in the first place, and I think that can be a bit hard to stomach for some people who think that orienteering is this like finely tuned sport with perfect mapping. Yeah, not really. Actually, the mapping is super fuzzy, and as you said, there are a number of articles out there that demonstrate this very clearly to show just how different areas can be interpreted. So I didn't actually notice this one on the map. I noticed the other one, though, that was down here, because this caught a lot of people out in the individual sprint. A lot of people didn't see the wall on the map, ran for the gap, then it's blocked, and so you can see all the red It's very cluttered in here with a lot going on, but it's from 11 to 12, isn't it? You have to go the green route, which is up to the road and then around the top. But everyone in red here are making mistakes where they're trying to run straight, but there's actually a wall. There's no way to get through. And that wall just disappeared on the new map, as you can see in this picture on the top right, that the wall's gone. So I think that's cool, especially when you are forced to reuse an area and you don't want to unfairly advantage or disadvantage those that have memorized the map from the previous day. You force everyone to start fresh and start critical of the new map. So I think that's really smart. We're quite used to this now with the artificial fences. So I think my concern would be more around maybe people just not expecting it at all and maybe jumping over something that they knew was passable the previous day, or something like that. Whereas when it's with the artificial fences and it's in magenta on the map and there's a big out of bounds area, it's very obvious. It's not just a thin black line that's changed. So I guess I worry that the amount of ink on the page that's changed is so small that there's maybe a fairer way to do it where there's more ink on the page that indicates the change. But I'm totally fine with a map being different from one day to the next. Also seems like some other changes were made that really don't have any bearing on the event, right? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I don't really know why they did that. It seems quite odd. It seems like an update that would happen 6 months later when the vegetation has changed slightly. Maybe it was that people complained about it, and they said, "Oh, this isn't quite match right," and they thought there's opportunity for them to update it. But it does seem quite odd to me. I think, like you're saying, I think it's better to be opening up gaps for the second time you're racing it rather than closing gaps where people might have, subconsciously thought, I've been here before, and they just run over it and don't check the map because they think that's fine. So I think there could have been some protest if that had happened and people got disqualified for it. Yeah, I still find it quite interesting, and I'm not sure how clearly it was relayed to the athletes beforehand that the map could be changed. If they said some gaps might be opened in tomorrow's race, then I think that's quite fair, and everyone knows and is given warning to check their reading.
Yep. So yeah, I think the more we talk about it, the more I'm getting confident in this overarching principle that maps are variable, and if you are purely reliant on one feature on the map at a time, then your orienteering is just not going to be very good most of the time anyway. So as a coach, I'm telling people you want to be holding your position relative to multiple features at the same time. And so if one thing's slightly different from one day to the next, you should just be like, oh, that's different. And I'm so in control that I'm like, I just noticed that it's different. And so I think if a map change is really throwing someone off, then perhaps they've got to look at their own navigation and wonder why they're so dependent on only one particular thing on the map. So that's really my closing thought with that. Maps are fuzzy. There's ambiguity all the time, whether the maps change from day to day or not.
It's also, I might just say, this goes back to maybe some of the prep we did for WOC in Denmark. When you're making your own map or looking at maps beforehand of a race, you have to be able to sort of change your mind on the fly. You have to be flexible when you run the actual race and not be locked into thinking this gap that I've looked at in Google Street View or looked at on the previous map that the NZ Champs organisers have uploaded for the sprint. You can't be stuck thinking that route there is the best way, because it might change when you go and pick up the map on your way to the start. So it's sort of similar to that situation.
Cool. The next topic this is my topic. I've really been interested in this at the moment because it's something I'm grappling with here at O-Ring, and that is planning a route in advance or at the control. So just first off, do you have any thoughts on on this. Do you like to plan ahead of time, or do you take your orienteering one leg at a time?
I'm quite one leg at a time, but I'll definitely have at least my exit direction planned and probably a rough idea of the route or the main route choice completed before I even see the previous control. But I'm not a sort of person who plans 2-3 legs in advance, at least not yet.
Yeah, so in terrain that I'm really comfortable with, like Auckland sand dunes, for example, I can plan very far in advance and I can maintain a very straight line in the meantime, and everything's happy. Everyone's going good. I get to every control and I not only know the exit, but probably know that you have to go straight to the next control anyway. So maybe most of them don't have that much planning anyway. But the ones that do have planning, I've sussed out pretty early. And I've just come into a number of hard races in Europe, and these races at O-Ringen especially, where the concentration required just to get the current leg under control is so much that I've been neglecting the planning ahead. And that's only an issue, I think, if you really believe that you should be planning ahead. And so that the first race here in Sweden, I was torn between these two approaches, which is probably the worst place to be, where you're trying to plan ahead in a situation where it's pretty clear that you don't have the skills to be multitasking between the current leg and future legs. So I think there's no right or wrong way to do it, but some terrain really lends itself to planning ahead, like anything where the runnability is nice, like there's not stony underground, there's not too many branches on the ground. Whereas here in Uppsala in Sweden, some of the terrain has been so tricky that I don't want to think about anything other than getting this next control. And I've had some rough times in the first couple of races here in the forest, just being on the wrong side of that trade-off.
Yeah. So you're saying that you'll be losing more time from making mistakes where you're lacking focus because you're trying to look at another leg than you would if you just ran that leg on its own, stopped the control, plan the next leg and run that leg.
Yeah, definitely. And it reduces the chance of doing admin errors at the control as well, because you're not flipping over and flicking back and forward between these different places in the map. You can just reset, refold the map and start on the next one. And that's something that I've definitely done 2 days ago. Admin error, leaving one control that I was a little bit flustered on the execution coming in. There was another competitor there, and then before I know it, I'm navigating from the wrong control. And all these things stack up to so easily outweigh a 3-second sacrifice at each control to get myself lined up and come up with a quick plan as I walk maybe the first 10 meters. Yeah, so definitely noticing that I should probably, we've got a race tomorrow again, and yeah, I'll just a lot more relaxed. I think I'll be a lot more relaxed at the controls, just knowing that I don't have to achieve this standard of perfection, because plenty of the top guys over here do that as well, because they know the trade-off that's been made. I think the issue comes from refusing to acknowledge that there's like two ways to do this, and it's not like one is right and one is wrong. You could do both of them well as long as you're executing that.
Yes, and definitely, I guess, as an experienced orienteer, you're used to being able to be planning ahead, and you might feel like you're doing bad orienteering if you're not doing a lot of planning ahead. But actually, like you say, it can end up being better in some situations.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I've also found over here that I'm not quite as sharp with the new terrain. It's not totally new to me, but I'm not as sharp as picking up the contour features as I would be with New Zealand mapping. So I'm extra slow on the fine detail reading. And so I need to bias myself even more towards unloading the mental load, and far more towards just only do what you need to do. So that's another thing for people to consider when they go to any new terrain. It could even just be Australia. They come from New Zealand to Australia, and the mapping style is different. So don't come in with the same expectations that you had when you were running in your local Christchurch maps, which you're very comfortable with. You're comfortable with the mapping style. You're comfortable with the types of terrain because you see it all the time. You're going to Australia where it's different, the different look in the terrain. You don't recognize the shapes. You don't recognize even just the grasses on the ground that might be different in the valleys and different on the hills. The different colors. You're not really sure what your brain is using to recognize a lot of these things in the terrain. There's a lot of subconscious stuff going on. So I think it's better to probably play it safer and try to wind back from this image of perfection that you had on your local terrain. So yeah, that was one thing that I found quite interesting that I'm grappling with at the moment. And the other thing I wanted to talk about in a bit more depth is specificity in training. So if anyone who's done, I guess, exercise science or something along those lines, probably PE at high school even, has understood specificity. What does that mean to you, Joseph?
For me, it would be training like pretty much exactly what I think I'm going to be doing in a race. So I've got this ultra long coming up, but I'm also looking into doing the New Zealand mountain running champs. And so for the last few weeks, that's been my main focus, has been doing hill intervals and repetitions, and even looking at the gradient of the course and trying to find routes around where I am that are at that gradient, so I can get used to it. My body gets used to it.
Yeah, and it's even more, I think, even more granular than that. Like different muscles getting used to the different gradient. Well, I guess that's what you mean, right? It's not just it's not you could work your quads on a bicycle, you could work your quads on a rowing machine, but it's all these other little neglected muscles as well that are getting worked a little bit differently in a different gradient or in a different terrain type, which is what I'm noticing over here, is that in a flat running race, I'm not that far behind some of these guys over here. But then you put us in terrain, and in order to hold on, I have to just blatantly follow, because I can't look at the map and look at the ground at the same time. My foot placement is not good enough. I'm not confident enough jumping off the rocks onto the ground below. I'm definitely not confident running over any of the jagged areas. I find myself, slowing down every time I hit some of these areas where I can't see the ground quite so much. And so what I've believed the past few years is that I can do most of my training in New Zealand because the difference between me and the top guys in Europe is physical, right? So I just need to get fitter. But what I really failed to acknowledge with that approach is the lack of specificity. I'm getting fitter on the trails, and my results, I guess, have shown that over the past 5 years. But I'm definitely not getting faster in Swedish and Scandinavian terrain. Definitely not. Maybe even slower, I think, which is kind of come as a bit of a shock, actually, because I thought I'd be closing the gap to the top guys, but I've actually gone backwards.
Do you think your actual, like your muscle strength is the main thing there, or the coordination? Like
Impossible. Impossible to know. And I think that's why specificity in training is really about just accurately replicating what you're going to be experiencing in the race. They're like holistically replicating it. So running in the right kind of terrain itself doesn't mean, okay, I'm going to run on some stony trails in New Zealand instead of stony Swedish terrain. That's going to get a little bit of something, but it's too hard to know what all the components are. You're ducking under the trees. There's these blueberries on the ground. You're popping up onto bare rock and then going down into a soft marsh. There's so many components here. And I noticed after my first race in Italy 2 weeks ago how sore my back muscles were from ducking under the branches. And that was something that I don't know how much of my fatiguing in a long distance race is actually because of muscles in my back that have no longer stabilizing my torso because they're so pooped. So it's just too hard to know the components, and I think you have to tackle it holistically, which can be really tricky from New Zealand. But I'm not really in denial about that now. I think it's become quite clear that although I can get fit training in New Zealand, there's not many places where I can actually replicate the terrain specificity.
Some terrains you would more than others, right? So there'd be some terrains in Europe or otherwhere in the world we would be able to replicate reasonably okay in New Zealand if you know exactly what you're looking for, which I guess that can be really helpful if you're on a trip overseas maybe, and you go to the terrain. Often people do this, the terrain before the next year's world champs, and then you know challenges, and you can maybe match it as best you can in New Zealand. You might be able to find a forest that is the most similar and gives the same pain in your back.
Yeah, and you can also target races over here that are not in quite so specialized terrain also. So races in Estonia and Latvia that I've done, suddenly I'm closer to the front. Czech Republic, okay, I'm only like 4 minutes behind the top guys. Go to Sweden, suddenly I'm 8 minutes behind the same people, and I have just as good of a race. So you can definitely take some of those factors into account. Also seen some of the JWOC races that we've done best at have been in terrain that definitely wasn't Scandinavian. So that's a huge chunk of the field no longer has this high level of confidence to the very particular type of terrain and the very particular look of the terrain as well. Like the bushes are different in different places in Europe, the tree types are different, the leaf cover is different, and so that they can't pick out these features so fast. So yeah, I think going for anything that's unique, I guess, or more generic, like super unique so that no one is hyper specialized at it, or kind of more generic so that it's an even playing field. Stuff like Czech Republic, that everyone's kind of run on terrain like that before.
Yeah, that's a good point though, because often people would think, I imagine, that the main challenge going to somewhere different for you is the navigation, but it is, like saying, the physical component actually makes a big difference as well.
Yeah, I think that's what I've noticed. Once I've got over that hurdle of not being a terrible navigator, which of course took many years to get over that hurdle. But yeah, once you're there, I think, so yeah, those who are younger or older and looking to do some more specific training, I do think you have to have a careful look at the terrain you're racing in and find what you can locally. But I've underestimated the importance of that basically in the past three or 4 years. And just haven't really done much in terrain at all, and have been pretty blasé about that. But it's pretty noticeable.
What do you think about the specificity of the climate? I was talking to Felix on a run and about his JWOC races, and he said, he just felt terrible and a lot less fit when he was running in the heat in Portugal, and then he came back to New Zealand last weekend and won the sprint and long at the NZ Schools Champs, and he felt like his fitness just jumped straight back up. How big of an impact do you think that plays?
Yep, definitely a big impact. And I think there's research that shows that your body takes a couple of weeks to adapt to a high like weather temperature change. So specificity, again, maybe you need to spend some time in a sauna, or maybe you need to train with a thermal on, or a thermal plus a jacket plus long pants, just like overdo it, because 37 degrees when you're racing is overdoing it. So if you want to prepare properly, then you've kind of got to do some pretty funny looking things.
Yeah.
Treadmill with a thermal on in the gym, kind of stuff like that. Just try to get your body used to it, because it is a shock for sure going from winter to European heat wave summer. And I've done it before, fortunately not this year, but that must have been very tough for the JWOC getting thrown into the furnace like that.
For sure.
Cool. So what are you looking forward to in the next month? You mentioned some of the races you're working towards. Is there anything else that you're doing on the side?
I'm pretty happy to be a spectator for the next few weeks. So I know a lot of people that are going to the World University Champs in Switzerland, and that'll be really cool. There's quite a big team this year, especially in the men's side. So that'll be really cool to watch, especially Switzerland. I know they're all very, very excited for that challenge. And then there's also the World Cup, the European Champs, that's being held in Estonia. And we've only got 2 Kiwis there this year, because Tim is in New Zealand. But that will be cool to see.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching the coverage of those races also. I'm moving to Canada, so I've got a bit on my plate to get our kind of lives reorganized and sorted in the next few weeks. So there'll be hopefully some time to watch some of the races, and I'm looking forward to continuing to do training in a new environment again and check out a new city.
Cool to discover all the new trails there. Do you know much about the orienteering scene?
Yeah, so in Vancouver, where we are, is a reasonable sprint orienteering scene. Lots of good sprint maps actually. The forest there is fairly bushy actually, so the classic orienteering is not quite as inspiring. And there's a number of other cities that are just 2 hours away that actually have also some activity and some quite diverse maps as well. So I think we're looking forward to doing some weekends away to check out all these different types of terrain. But once again, I think the local stuff will be mainly trail running, but I'm looking forward to maybe finding a terrain loop or some kind of softer ground and stonier ground that I can do on a weekly basis to get that specificity that we were talking about. Because in Wellington, I've just been on the hard trails, and it might be time to get some softer running in somehow.
Do you think you would try use that and time yourself on the same loop each week to track your progress?
Yeah, we could. If it's a standard loop, then I'm always interested in, can't help but compare between week on week. But I also just like exploring also. So just going rogue on a hill somewhere might also be something that happens. Cool. Well, thanks for doing the first one with us, Joe. And because we've got this rolling host, I'm not quite sure at the stage he'll be on next month. But stay well, and see you next time.
Look forward to more. See you, Jane.
If you liked the show, please support it by sharing this podcast with one person who would benefit from it. The best place to find more content like this is at gbeverage.nz, where you can find years of training blogs, race reports, podcasts, and coaching videos. If you don't want to miss future episodes, I recommend subscribing to my newsletter by visiting gbeverage.nz or by following on social media, Perfect Flow on Facebook and Gene Beverage on Instagram. For Q&A, send messages to nav@perfectflow.nz.